Shalom, everyone. We're gathered today on the 24th of December, 2025, on the Gregorian calendar, which coincides with the 15th of the 10th month on our Creator's calendar. And we're having a little get together. We decided to cover, or at least go over a little bit, the nullity known as the 14th Amendment, or the fact that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is void from enactment. It was never even enacted, for one, and it's one of the major plagues that are being used to ruin our nation. Through this 14th Amendment, courts have usurped our rights for privileges and made this into a citizen that was subject to the jurisdiction of our government and inferior to the state citizen who had unalienable rights endowed by our Creator, right? It's all color of law. It's all hocus pocus, tricky wordplay. It's Jesuit influence in our country and in our government. So it's not lawful, but it is what has happened. There's quite a bit of information that we have on the topic. I want to show you some of these PDFs, and if I can, I'll try to share them. If they're not still available online, I'll try to share them. This one is entitled The Dubious Origin of the 14th Amendment by Walter J. Sutton Jr. from the Tulane Law Review, Volume 28, page 22. And this itself is multiple pages as well. I believe, yeah, it goes in 18 pages. I don't want to cover everything in it. I just want to read the first paragraphs or two so you can get an idea of what this is about. All right. Says the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States has loomed large in recent years in litigation before the United States Supreme Court involving contentions for restriction of state regulatory power and enlargement of federal regulatory power. And really, this is a null because we already have the Ninth and 10th Amendments to the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. We've talked about that before, but anything not expressly delegated is reserved to the states and the people respectively. And whatever is not expressly delegated to the states is left to the people. They don't have the right to just make up their own stuff and do whatever they want. But we've been misled to believe that is true. It says under this amendment and its companion or satellite amendment to the 15th, the United States Supreme Court in the past approximately 15 years, as a slow boil, right? Increasingly made this more perverted, but they didn't do it all right from the front. It has been a work in progress for the last 150 years or more. But he has repeatedly rendered decisions aimed at coercing racial integration and breaking down established systems of racial segregation in political, educational, social, economic, and other fields in the southern states, and in some instances outside the South. It is not the purpose of this article to discuss the merits of segregation or of its antitype, racial integration. These are questions upon which each of us has his or her own individual view, belief, and conviction, based on what we think and how we think. What is to be discussed relates to the use of the 14th Amendment by the United States Supreme Court as an implement for invading the areas formerly reserved to state regulation. And this is the key. The whole purpose of the Counter-Reformation, the whole purpose of the Counter-Reformation is to destroy the Reformation, everything that it brought about that was positive, including popular government. And in that, they have systematically worked to turn around, pervert, and ruin every institution, every founding principle, every way that our country is supposed to function on purpose. When you keep that in mind, and I have the documents from them to prove this is the intention, we've covered it before, but there's literally an encyclical from the Little Horn, Bishop of Rome, that was named Leo before this one, from the 1890s, where they absolve every Catholic and probably all the Freemasons that serve them from any culpabilities, so-called, of violating their oath of office to the Constitution. And they void that so that they can trample upon it and do the will of the little horn. They also wanted a pogrom where they did like a Saint Bartholomew massacre in our country. That was their intention, but they have yet to actually get us to agree to be disarmed. Either way, this is part of their plan for usurping our popular government by having the Supreme Court make fiat legislative or executive and judicial decisions where they don't have the power to do that and make law, all right? Giving it to the federal instead of the state, or to individual or group actions, meaning special interests, and for breaking down established systems of racial segregation and setting up compulsive racial interassociation. In effect, compulsive racial integration. In this field, the Equal Protection of the Laws Clause and the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment are those most frequently invoked in support of those legal attacks upon our fundamental way of life. The very things that they try to use as benefits to the people, that they were the ones, if you remember, Rome is the instigators of slavery in our country. They fermented those passions and the fighting between slavery and non-slavery and every divisive thing to cause and foment the Civil War. It was intentional. And then they use the aftermath here to continue their plan of usurping our rights. But it's like a chess game. They do these things with cause and effect already planned out. All right. So this is what this is about. It's an 18-page document. The next one here, I want to cover this one actually a little more detail, and then we'll look at the others. There's three more that we want to look at. All of them are in relation to what we're talking about here, though. It says, "There is no 14th Amendment" by David Lawrence. And this is a side note, but the Lawrences, just like the McDonald's, the Macintosh, and others, are a name from the Caledonian history. The ancient history of Caledonia specifically is a history of one of the righteous remnants of the Hebrews, descendants from the seed of Abraham, that stayed true to the law given to them for a long time. And they had a quite an interesting history. But either way, this is from the U.S. News and World Report from September 27, 1957. So this is quite old for our times, but it was still known at this time and nothing was done about it. Interspersed between, this is after two world wars or in the middle of one, at the end of one. And then you had Vietnam coming up, the Korean War. You had other distractions that were going on and people did not pay attention. This is a mistaken belief that there is a valid article in the Constitution known as the 14th Amendment is responsible for the Supreme Court decision of 1954 and the ensuing controversy over desegregation in the public schools of America. No such amendment was ever legally ratified by 3/4 of the states of the Union, as required by the Constitution itself. And that's what I'm talking about. It was never properly ratified, so it never should exist, period. And even if it had been properly ratified, the fact that it is contrary to the supreme law makes it void from enactment. So either way you want to cut that, this thing does not exist. It should not exist. And it is our responsibility to enforce that, make it happen, not just rely on public servants to do what they're, whatever they will. But it says the so-called 14th Amendment was dubiously proclaimed by the Secretary of State on July 20th, 1868. The president shared that doubt. There were 37 states in the Union at the time. So ratification by at least 28 was necessary to make the amendment an integral part of the Constitution. Actually, only 21 states legally ratified it, so it failed of ratification. The undisputed record, attested by official journals and the unanimous writings of historians, establishes these events as occurring in 1867 and 1868. 1. Outside the South, 6 states, New Jersey, Ohio, Kentucky, California, Delaware, and Maryland, failed to ratify the proposed amendment. 2. In the South, 10 states, Texas, Arkansas, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana, by formal action of their legislators, rejected it under the normal processes of civil law, meaning they didn't just not ratify it, they formally rejected it. 3. A total of 16 legislators out of 37 failed to legally ratify the 14th Amendment, meaning a total, that's not including, I believe, the 16, or that is the 16 total. Sorry. 4. Congress, which had deprived the southern states of their seats in the Senate, did not lawfully pass the resolution of submission in the first instance. 5. And if you don't know what that means, after the southern states would not ratify, they were removed. They put in, the North forced every state that rejected it to have a different Congress set up, and they made them ratify it before they allowed them back into the Union. It was all garbage under threat of force and coercion. Number 5, it says the southern states which had rejected the amendment were coerced, I should have just kept reading, by a federal statute passed in 1867 that took away the right to vote or hold office from all citizens who had served in the Confederate Army. And this was after they said that there would be nothing like that done, but then they killed Abraham Lincoln and did it anyways. Military governors were appointed and instructed to prepare the roll of voters. All this happened in spite of the presidential proclamation of amnesty previously issued by the president. New legislatures were thereupon chosen or forced to ratify under penalty of continued exile from the Union. In Louisiana, a general, and this is all under duress, it's all void. You can't coerce them and do things contrary to the Constitution and have it be lawful, right? In Louisiana, a general sent down from the north presided over the state legislature, not the governor, not the assistant governor or anyone that was supposed to. 6. Abraham Lincoln declared many times that the Union was inseparable and indivisible. After his death, and when the war was over, the ratification by the Southern states of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, had been accepted as legal. But even that was not, it wasn't a very well done statute. We've talked about it before. It could have been worded better. And the original 13th Amendment, which was not ever removed, it was just no longer acknowledged, but it was found in later, older copies of the Constitution. The original 13th Amendment barred anyone from holding a position of office or trust and having a title of nobility. So you could not be a bar member and an esquire and serve any public station. But either way, it says, but Congress in 1867 law imposed the specific conditions under which the southern states would be entitled to representation in Congress, meaning that the law that they had originally passed here was a nullity based on their not being legitimate then, but that's a fiat thing. It's not real. Number 7, Congress, in passing the 1867 law, declared the Southern states could not have their seats in either the Senate or House in the next session unless they ratified the 14th Amendment, took an unprecedented step. No such right to compel a state by an act of Congress to ratify a constitutional amendment is to be found anywhere in the Constitution, nor has this procedure ever been sanctioned by the Supreme Court of the United States. And even if they did support it and make a fiat ruling that they could do that, it would be unlawful ruling and they would be committing treason. It's not in the Constitution to allow them, and every judge swears to uphold the Constitution. Number 8, President Andrew Johnson publicly denounced this law as unconstitutional, but it was passed over his veto. Number 9, Secretary of State Seward was on the spot in July 1868 when the various ratifications of a spurious nature were placed before him. The legislatures of Ohio and New Jersey had notified him that they rescinded their earlier action of ratification. He said in his official proclamation that he was not authorized as Secretary of State to determine and decide doubtful questions as to the authenticity of the organization of state legislatures or as to the power of any state legislature to recall a previous act or resolution of ratification. Now, if they can ratify, they can rescind. You have the power to do one, you have the power to do both. He added that the amendment was valid if the resolutions of the legislatures of Ohio and New Jersey ratifying the aforesaid amendment are to be deemed as remaining in of full force and effect, notwithstanding the subsequent resolutions of the legislatures of these states. This was a very big if. It will be noted that the real issue, therefore, is not whether the forced ratification by the 10 southern states was lawful, but whether the withdrawal by the legislatures of Ohio and New Jersey, 2 northern states, was legal. The right of a state, by action of its legislature, to change its mind at any time before the final proclamation of ratification is issued by the Secretary of State, has been confirmed in connection with other constitutional amendments, and they've gone back and forth beforehand. It used to be if the member or the one sitting in the council didn't do the will of the people, they'd go remove him immediately and send someone else to do what they wanted. Number 10, the Oregon legislature in October 1868, 3 months after the Secretary's proclamation was issued, passed a rescinding resolution, which argued that the 14th Amendment had not been ratified by 3/4 of the states and that the ratifications in the southern states were usurpations, unconstitutional, revolutionary, and void. And that, quote, until such ratification is completed, any state has a right to withdraw its assent to any proposed amendment, unquote. What do the historians say about all this? The Encyclopedia Americana states, quote, Reconstruction added humiliation to suffering, Lispis. 8 years of crime, fraud, and corruption followed, and it was state legislators composed of Negroes, carpetbaggers, and scalawags who obeyed the orders of the generals and ratified the amendment. So it was now, this isn't to be disrespectful to anybody, but they kicked out the people who were intelligent for their rights and worth fighting and knew that they should not just bow or kowtow to this. And they put in people who would agree and go along with it. Whether that was anybody, it was the ones they put in. It doesn't matter about your skin color. It was just former slaves that were yes men were used just like other people. It doesn't matter who you were. If you were doing that, they called you a scalawag otherwise. So W.E. Woodward, and please, for anyone, this was before it was considered a derogatory thing. They're not trying to be disrespectful, but they were pointing out that they were using people who didn't know better to accomplish things in an unlawful manner. All right. W.E. Woodward, in his famous work, A New American History, published in 1936, says, to get a clear idea of the succession of events, let us review President Andrew Johnson's actions in respect to the ex-Confederate States. In May 1865, he issued a proclamation of amnesty to former rebels. Then he established provisional governments in all the southern states. They were instructed to call constitutional conventions. They did. The new state governments were elected. White men only had the suffrage. The 15th Amendment establishing equal voting rights had not yet been passed. Senators and representatives were chosen, but when they appeared at the opening of Congress, they were refused admission. The state governments, however, continued to function during 1866. Now we are in 1867. In the early days of that year, Thaddeus Stevens brought in, as chairman of the House Reconstruction Committee, a bill that proposed to sweep all the southern state governments into the wastebasket. The South was to be put under military rule. The bill passed. It was vetoed by Johnson and passed again over his veto. In the Senate, it was amended in such fashion that any state could escape from military rule and be restored to its full rights by ratifying the 14th Amendment and admitting black as well as white men to the polls. Now, I don't want to go into the issues that others had with this, but just for some context, it was originally made that when men were slaves to another, they would not be counted as a full vote for passing laws because they were allowed to vote. They were just another vote for the slave owner, and they would be doing what they were told. So they were not counted as a full man in that capacity under the Constitution. It was not to degrade them as less than a man or anything like that, but it was so that there would not be cheating in the voting by using them. It didn't work out so well, and it was later used and contrived and used in ways that was unlawful and against our best interests. But that was the reason why it was put there. In challenging its constitutionality, President Andrew Johnson said in his veto message, quote, I submit to Congress whether this measure is not in its whole character, scope, and object without precedent, and without authority, in palpable conflict with the plainest provisions of the Constitution, and utterly destructive of those great principles of liberty and humanity or compassion, for which our ancestors on both sides of the Atlantic have shed so much blood and expended so much treasure. Many historians have applauded Johnson's words. Samuel Eliot Morison and Henry Still Commager, known today as liberals, wrote in their book, The Growth of the American Republic, quote, Johnson returned the bill with a scorching message arguing the unconstitutionality of the whole thing, and most impartial students have agreed with his reasoning. James Truslow Adams, another noted historian, writes in his History of the United States, the Supreme Court has decided 3 months earlier, in the Milligan case, Lispis, that military courts were unconstitutional except under such war conditions as might make the operation of civil courts impossible. And they're only constitutional under wartime if you're in active duty or conscripted in the military or militia during wartime activities. There is no other time that you have lack of due process with the war tribunal. That's administrative court, or that's Roman common municipal courts, and that's not common law, or it shouldn't be, rather. But it says, but the president pointed out in vain that practically the whole of the new legislation was unconstitutional. Lispus. There was even talk in Congress of impeaching the Supreme Court for its decisions. The legislature had run amok and was threatening both the executive and the judiciary because it's what the Catholics had control of at the time. Actually, President Johnson was impeached, but the move failed by one vote in the Senate. The Supreme Court, in case after case, refused to pass on the illegal activities involved in ratification. It said simply that they were acts of the political departments of the government. This, of course, was a convenient device of avoidance. The court has adhered to that position ever since Reconstruction days. Andrew C. McLaughlin, whose Constitutional History of the United States is a standard work, writes, quote, can a state which is not a state and not recognized as such by Congress perform the supreme duty of ratifying an amendment to the fundamental law? Or does a state, by congressional thinking, cease to be a state for some purposes but not for others? Unquote. This is the tragic history of the so-called 14th Amendment, a record that is a disgrace to free government and a government of law. Isn't the use of military force to override local government what we deplored in Hungary? It is never too late to correct injustice. And until we do, our people are going to be destroyed for lack of knowledge. So long as we continue in sin and we have the people of America actively participating in sun worship for like what they're doing tomorrow, we can't have justice because we're willingly serving and under the jurisdiction as a nation of the enemy of justice. So you can't serve Satan and fight against him. It doesn't work. But it says the people of America should have an opportunity to pass on an amendment to the Constitution that sets forth the right of the federal government to control education and regulate attendance at public schools, either with federal power alone or concurrently with the states. That's the honest way, the just way to deal with the problem of segregation or integration in the schools. Until such an amendment is adopted, the 14th Amendment should be considered as null and void. And it is, they're coming up with a different way to come about removing segregation, which is fine. I'm not advocating for segregation or against it or anything of such nature. I think that we all ought to be, as our Creator intended, peaceable, kind, loving individuals where the law is the same for the native born and the sojourner who sojourns with you, right? But he said that, sorry. He says there is only one supreme tribunal. It is the people themselves. Their sovereign will is expressed through the procedures set forth in the Constitution itself. And again, that was from 1957. Now, we won't read all three, or sorry, we will not read all the way through for the rest of these, but I do want to show you a few more that have to do with this topic, okay? This one right here we'll actually get to in just a minute. That one's different, so I don't want to cover that. Right here, it's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the threat that it poses to our republic or democratic government is what's written here. Now, all of the two of these can be found at this PACIN, pacinlaw.org. Whether or not this is still active, I don't know. But again, if anyone would like me to, I will upload these documents to Internet Archive and I can put the links in the description. Just let me know. This one has to do with how this is a threat, and it is, I believe, oh, excuse me. Yeah, it's 25 pages long. So I just want to read the first paragraphs here, and you can get an idea of what this is about. It says the major part of this trustees is directed to the invalidity of the purported 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the circumstances which caused honorable men, U.S. senators, and representatives, who doubtless did not consider their conduct to be unethical or dishonorable, to, quote, take the law into their own hands, unquote, to accomplish what they considered to be in the best interests of the nation. Now, some of it might have been well meaning but ignorant intentions here. There is a great movement of intentional malfeasance and usurpation by Rome and the Jesuits. The black conspiracy called the Unholy Alliance about the overthrow and destruction of popular government was a thing that they established in the mid 1800s and had been actively working on since then. It was actually the whole Council of Vienna where they originally made their alliance with the Little Horn and the monarchs of Europe to overthrow popular government was entered into the congressional record by Senator, I believe it was Senator Owen. I might be mistaken on that, but both that and the Jesuit oath are in the congressional records of our nation. It says, but in my dissertation on the 14th Amendment and the circumstances of its purported adoption, I am using it as a vehicle to demonstrate that under the present law of the United States, as decided by the Supreme Court, our entire democratic republican form of government, our system of checks and balances, our way of life, is faced with a threat of utter destruction. I bring this danger to the attention of the citizens and the Congress of the United States while there is yet time to provide a remedy. At the outset, I desire to say that this article is not motivated by a dissatisfaction evidenced in some quarters with recent rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States, nor am I advocating any effort to have the 14th Amendment declared invalid, although I deplore the means that were employed to obtain the end. Now, the means were unlawful, and as you saw, 16 states never ratified, and some of them rescinded after the fact. So even considering all of that, it was never properly ratified. It says, I have sincere concern for the future of our form of government in times of great national economic stress resulting from the legal precedents established by the irregular procedures attending the adoption of the 14th Amendment. Lenin, Hitler, Mussolini, and others did not become dictators without widespread support of many short sighted people. And what we have going on in our presidents is very close to dictatorship and fiat rules from executive decisions that have no validity in our country's constitution. The current president said he doesn't even know if he has to follow the Constitution. It's open treason. I don't say it to be too fickle. I hope that these men repent because if you violate your oath of office, you have the same thing to look forward to as any liar. They get the lake of fire. It's guaranteed for you. You can't make an oath and break it. It's never going to fly. And a covenant, once ratified, is confirmed. No man sets it aside. That's what Shaul clearly explains in the scriptures. Our founders knew that anyone that was going to commit treason deserved hellfire and eternal damnation. So they made them swear an oath to uphold it under their creator. Right? We'll stop there with this one. You can see what it's about. It goes on for quite a while. It is quite a few pages, but it is a decent read. The other one here goes into the detail about how it was stolen, kind of what the others summarized, that first one summarized that we read, but this goes into a little more detail. I believe it's, yeah, 12 pages long. But this is from L.C. Leone, The Day Our Country Was Stolen, How the 14th Amendment Enslaved Us All Without a Shot Fired. Most Americans would agree that we as a people are treated by our public servants, the judges, politicians, law enforcement, and bureaucrats who are paid their salaries by our taxes, as if we were in complete bondage to them. When we joke about being slaves to the government, we don't realize that we are exactly correct, joke or not. In fact, all those 99% of Americans who call themselves, quote, U.S. citizens, unquote, are actually subject to the corporate United States government, not the sovereign states of the Union. Now, I want you to please take this to heart. It seems like it's semantics, but it is the words that you use that they use against you in a court of law and everywhere else. When you agree to be a U.S. citizen, you are agreeing to be under the 14th Amendment, which means you are subject to the jurisdiction of the federal government. It tells you right there. You don't have to agree to be a U.S. citizen. You can be a state citizen. You can be an American. These are your rights as a man born in this country. But the words you use are used against you. It doesn't matter that you don't know there's no difference or there is a difference between them. Again, the maxim of Rome is he who will be deceived, let him. So it's really on us to learn these things and not allow them to dupe us. It says the moment you uttered your first cry on American soil, you became the chattel property of the corporation known as the United States of America, which, because of the federal debt, handed title, birth certificate, to your body and soul to the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, that's not quite right. The little horn in 1302 or whatever it was declared, and this was the second time that you had the dark horse rider sign in the sky. The first time was during the times of Vespasian and Titus when they were decimating the land. And the second time you saw that sign, Monoceros, um, and the alignment of the stars as foretold in Revelation there was when he made the papal bull Unum Sanctum, where he declared that all souls of all men, all human beings were subject to the little horn, and he had a right to all the souls of men, property, and all lands. Doesn't make it true, but this is the thing that he put out. That was used later on to that was the premise behind the British government's 1666 Act, the 1660, the Siskiyou Trust Act that they put forth where everyone was lost at sea. And then that was also used after the Reconstruction era to put in the Social Security cards and the birth certificates with this Federal Reserve and have everyone as a debt slave, where your bank, or, sorry, your birth certificate is also a banknote that's traded on the stock market, right? Other people have tried to go off and say that these monies are used for you, but really, not in the way that you think. You're used as collateral, and it's your worth and earnings in life that are held as collateral for the debt that they pull out. You're literally made into a debt slave by your public servants, treasonously. To be held in the archives of the Department of Health and Human Services. Remember, human is the reprobate, the natural man, that it cannot receive the things of the Ruach of Elohim. A man is endowed by their creator with dominion in this world. So there is a difference there. One was given and a word in scripture with a meaning, and the other is not a word in scripture. It was made up afterwards with its own meaning. And when you call yourself that, you put yourself in that jurisdiction, not because you believe that, but because they play games with you and they force it because of what you say. It's only allowed to happen when you are actively in sin and under the jurisdiction of Satan. Otherwise, these things have no power over you. As incredible as this sounds, it is sadly true. The next question is, how did I automatically become subject to a government when I'm supposedly a free American? How did this all come about? That I should be made to register myself, my family, and all that I own, to be made to obey oppressive laws, and forfeit almost half of my earnings upon threat of jail. Only those who are subject to a government can be made to do these things. Free American inhabitants are subject to no one but Elohim, and all the laws and responsibilities which that Elohim or Elohim's allegiance entails, meaning you have to keep the Torah. You're either in his kingdom and keeping his law, or you're in the kingdom of Satan and forced to keep his laws. Which United States do you live in? The answer to the above questions goes back rather to the American Civil War. The war that was supposedly fought to free the slaves from bondage actually did just the opposite for all Americans then and in the future. By enacting the 14th Amendment, which technically is an article, not a true amendment, but that's a topic for another discussion. A whole nation of newly freed slaves and freeborn white American inhabitants became citizens of the United States, i.e., of a federal government corporation at the stroke of a pen and without a shot being fired, and unlawful, void from enactment because it's contrary to the supreme law of the land. It doesn't become a law just because it sounds like it is. It's color of law. Excuse me. It says, because we Americans are a different breed and demand a right to personal freedom, those who had planned decades ago to enslave us, even if it took generations to do so, knew that as long as we were armed and willing to fight to maintain our freedom, the only way to accomplish this enslavement was by deception. To proceed further, we must comprehend that there are two United States, and one was a lowercase u. There is the United States, there you go, note the small u in United, which describes the ideological and geographical position of the sovereign states of America. An individual was voluntarily inhabitant of the state in which he resided. If he did not like the laws or practices of that state, he could simply move to another state. Each state was sovereign to itself and could not be forced to accept the laws and practices of any other state. The United States of America, however, is the name of the corporate entity. Note the capital U in United, that exists to carry out the functions delegated to it by the states for the protection of the Union. Now, it wasn't always that way. This is part of the usurpation. It was never delegated for them to make a corporation and to do all these things. It's a usurpation of our delegated powers that we gave to them. It says this corporate entity's jurisdiction is supposed to be, according to the Constitution, confined to the District of Columbia, the federal territories, and the federal enclaves. Enclaves are areas within the state's boundaries which are ceded to the federal government by the state legislature, like post offices and other government buildings, military bases, and etc. Anyone can come under the direct jurisdiction of the corporate United States in three ways. One, by living in one of its territories. Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, etc. 2, by living in the District of Columbia, or 3, simply by choice. Back when, and that choice of stating that you're a United States citizen is literally committing perjury and treason against the lawful constitutional republic. So you have to be a traitor to our real government to be in this one. This is back when America still had vast territories not yet become states, and several thousands of people lived in these territories. These people had no rights protected by state sovereignty. They lived under federal jurisdiction, which was the reason why people living in territories were so anxious to achieve statehood. The president could order federal troops into any territory and enact any edicts he wanted. Once a territory became a state, it had sovereignty, and from that point on, the state's rights prevailed. So, if you don't live in a territory or enclave, and you don't live in the District of Columbia, then the only way you could have fallen under the jurisdiction of the United States government is by choice. But neither I nor anyone I know voluntarily or knowingly surrendered their personal sovereignty to the government, which means that our sovereignty, was taken from us by deception. This deception, which took place in the year 1868, is what this article will explain: how our ancestors were tricked and coerced into giving up their rights and ours. And no one can give up their rights. An inalienable right cannot be given up. It can be deceptively taken or repressed by force, but that right is not theirs to take and it's not ours to give. But it says that, and to the jurisdiction of the federal government. Civil war sets the stage for takeover. So the Constitution for the United States of America specifies in the opening paragraph that the Constitution was written for the newly formed corporation, not for us, the people living in America. Our rights come from Elohim and are inalienable. Are, inalienable. They do not come from a piece of paper. And because the federal government exists only on paper, a man-created entity, it can also be dismantled any time we, the people, decide it has become a threat to our inalienable Elohim given rights of sovereignty. The Constitution is the contract between those who administer the government's affairs and the people of the United States. In essence, it states that the people will give the government certain powers necessary to administer the defense of the states and control the commerce into the states from foreign countries. In exchange, the state governments, not the individual people, direct taxation by the federal government is unconstitutional, would provide the federal government the money it needs to operate. The federal government had limited powers. In fact, the Bill of Rights was hotly debated at the time of its passage because there were several people who wisely cautioned that the Bill of Rights would eventually be construed as rights endowed by the Constitution, not protected by it, which is exactly what has happened. How often do you hear patriots mistakenly vow to defend their constitutional rights? This thinking reflects the decades of public school brainwashing to which we have all been subjected. We need to correct each other and comprehend that our rights are given, not constitutional. So how does the Civil War enter into this present day power struggle between the federal government and us, the people? Slavery was not the true underlying reason for the war. It was an emotional, social issue that was used as an excuse to incite people to go to war. People who did not realize that foreign agencies were responsible for that conflict. meaning Rome and the Jesuits, the Holy Alliance, as they called themselves. International bankers, seeing the slavery issue as an opportunity not only to divide the country but make millions of dollars as well, fanned the flames of debate until, under the cover of the most bloody war in the history of the world, they were to accomplish that very objective, the complete takeover of America. They almost succeeded years sooner, except for the intervention of one man, President Abraham Lincoln. Honest Abe knew the truth. President Lincoln was against slavery, but he comprehended that it was wrong to force the southern states to give up slavery. Now, he also comprehended that it was either the government of the United States or slavery that had to go, because the two could not coincide together with the institutions of a free government and that kind of practice. The foundations of our declaration declared all men equal, and to have something so repugnant as to endorse, institutionalize a mockery of that was an affront to our Maker. And that's why we had this allowed to happen to us. But he said, he made a vow to our Maker that if the North had been successful in a certain battle, he would put out the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was our Creator giving the victory as he had asked for himself that enabled him to know it was his desire in that time to do such a thing. So you can argue with that if you want to, but that's the reality of what actually transpired. It says, to force federal jurisdiction over the issue of states' rights. And it was a states' issue. The people were having to handle it as such, but it could have been directly handled according to the Constitution with the proper ratification of amendments like the 13th should have been. It could have been done properly. It says 4 of the southern states were already considering the abolition of slavery, but they couldn't just abandon it overnight. It would take time. After all, their whole economy was built upon slavery. A sudden disruption would bankrupt the South. Lincoln comprehended this, but it wasn't until Lincoln got into office that he began to see the whole picture. He learned that the war was begun by the international bankers as the means of dividing the country in two. And that's an intentional, that's a deception. He knew and declared that it was the nefarious influences of the Jesuits and Rome that got us involved in that war. He was very clear on that part. There's a quote from him from a book called The 50 Years in the Church of Rome by Charles Chiniquy, where he's directly talking about that. It's also quoted, I believe, in The Secret Terrorists or The Enemies Unmasked, where Abraham was talking about that. And there's a few other books by a gentleman named Wilcox. He wrote The President, the Pope, and the Priest, or The Priest, the President, and the something else. And then I'm terribly sorry. I have all my books packed.
Priest, Pope, and President.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And then the other one was uh, I can't remember, but it was about America, the something of the promised land, perversion of the promised land or something to that effect. But he goes through
Haven't
doc
read it.
I'm sorry, brother.
So I haven't read that one.
Ah, I do have both. I'll have to get a copy for you or show you a link for it so you can see that one too. I believe it's in that one. It might be in both of them, but right there in the beginning is that encyclical from 1893 where they were talking about releasing all of the Catholics from their oath of office to be subservient to the United States government.
Mm.
All right. So it says, in either way, it was directly influenced by Rome. It was not just international bankers. They used the international bankers, but they had control of them. It says that they were used as a means of dividing the country in two, forcing both sides to borrow heavily from the bankers to pay war debts. Then, when failing to repay those loans, they divided America would be forced into bankruptcy. The Rothschilds and other bankers could then simply foreclose on the corporations known as the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. President Lincoln knew he had to keep the nation together at all costs, including war. Saved by the national banks. Near the end of the war, the South was on its knees and the U.S. government was nearly bankrupt. Seeing their opportunity, the bankers offered to loan the U.S. government enough to see it through. Lincoln said no, he would find another way. What he did then was to ask Congress for permission to print paper money, even though he knew it was unconstitutional. Only gold and silver are lawful U.S. money. It was the only way he knew to buy provisions for the army, but only if the U.S. banks would accept it. They did, when Lincoln gave his word that the government would redeem those notes for gold and silver at a later time. They believed him and honored the notes. By doing this, the planned takeover by the bankers was averted at that time. The bankers' revenge, or Rome's revenge, was assassination. And again, the absolute proof that Rome was completely culpable and planned and perpetrated his murder is in quite a few books. There's a tribunal, the military tribunal that happened, and one of the officers that was part of the trial wrote a book about it. It's in 50 Years of the Church of Rome, where Charles Chiniquy was the first in the 1880s when he discovered that to publish the facts, witness statements, and sworn testimonies to prove that they had disclosed the information of his death hours before it actually happened, or and hours before it could have been known in a small town away from the telegram or post. But it says, because he had given his word to the nation's bankers, because he had promised the South that upon surrender, the government would help them rebuild, and because he had promised the Southerners there would be no recriminations or punishments if they again swore loyalty to the Union, Lincoln knew he had to get reelected, though he was tried, tormented by migraine headaches, and worried about his suffering family life. He had to make sure those promises were kept. Lincoln's complete thwarting of the international bankers' plans doomed him to assassination at their hands. Papers found in Booth's locker show communications with an agent hired by the Rothschild family, but no mention of Rome's culpability, so I find that very, very sad that that's not even mentioned here. Weeks before he was killed, Lincoln knew he would die in office. His spies were reporting plots to kill him. It was only a matter of who got to him first. So he met regularly with his vice president, Andrew Johnson, and educated him as quickly as he could so that he could follow through on Lincoln's promises. Johnson listened carefully and comprehended what was expected of him and why. Then, after Lincoln's murder, he did exactly as he was supposed to do. And I can't vouch for any of that. I don't know firsthand or if he was influenced by Rome at all. I've heard different things.
Let's
In
con- let's conclude this, Richard, since I heard you yawning. Well,
All right, brother. Let me finish this paragraph and we'll stop at the impeach, okay? So it says, in school, when we were taught this part of American history, we were told that Andrew Johnson was uneducated and ignorant and fumbled continuously in office, which was supposedly why he was impeached. Johnson was of humble origin, but he was an honest, self-educated man who stood firmly for what he saw clearly were the best interests of his country. This is what got him impeached. All right, and then this goes on more, but it gives into the history, and you can see from this gentleman's point of view the nefarious things that happened and the ways that our enslavement came about through this 14th Amendment, which hopefully everyone can see by now is a nullity, does not exist in actual law, and we should not consider it to have any force or effect if we want to know what's good for us. But for now, you all have a great rest of your night, and we will see you on Shabbat. Shalom, everybody.